In today's video, we're going to talk about certain colours, certain watercolour colours that can be problematic and difficult to use. Welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Michelle. On this channel, you'll find watercolour videos like this one, as well as watercolour pencils, drawing, mixed media, even a bit of business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. It's free to subscribe and I make at least one free video a week here on YouTube. If you'd like to further support the channel or get extra content all about colour mixing, click the join button below to find out more. So we're going to look at colours which are difficult to use. These are particularly colours that I have seen students get in trouble with over many years of teaching. We're going to go through them one by one. And I'm going to explain why they are difficult to use. Now, I want to say at this point that there are no bad colours. There are no colours that you shouldn't be using ever. But there are certainly some colours that beginners in particular get in really a lot of trouble with. It's not always their fault. Sometimes it's to do with the properties of the pigments themselves or the way the manufacturers have presented them to the beginner that get them into some trouble. Now, before we get started, I will mention that I will be talking about black and white in this video. Please don't come into the comments and say, oh, black isn't a colour, white is. I know, it's literally my job. It's the only thing I'm any good at. But nevertheless, these are items that you're going to find in your palette and we're going to talk about them today. So for the purpose of this video, we're going to include them as if they were hues, even though technically they aren't. So we're going to go through 10 colours. I'm going to tell you why they're problematic, what you can do about it and when it's appropriate to use them, and when it's not. So a couple of weeks ago, somebody said to me, why do you never speak in your videos about Alizarin Crimson? Why is there a pink in your own beginner's set rather than an alizarin? Why don't you talk about this colour? It's included in so many starter sets and so many split primary sets. And that person is absolutely right. It's time we had a conversation about Alizarin Crimson. So the Alizarin Crimson I've got here is by Winsor & Newton. It's a very good one, because some of the cheaper ones can look a little bit murky. You'll notice it has the word permanent on. I don't know if you can see that on camera. And that's because Alizarin Crimson, in fact, many of the roses and the pinks historically have been prone to fading very badly. So this one has obviously been formulated to be more permanent. So that's something you should look for. And let's swatch this colour. So it's sort of a crimson colour. And if we water it down, we're going to get a pink. It's a rather delicate pink, isn't it? It's a colour that I sometimes use if I'm painting roses. I've also got a madder crimson in another brand, which is almost identical to this colour. As I said, quite useful for painting roses. Not the brightest colour. Let me swatch my quinacridone pink next to it. This is a Talens Rembrandt colour. And you can see it's brighter. It's more sort of blue-based, cooler in other words. More pink, less red. Now, if you've ever looked at printers' colours, at the CMYK colours, you'll notice that they use a magenta colour like this, as opposed to a red pink like this. And that's because you can mix so many more colours from this one. I've got some cobalt blue in my palette, so let's look at what happens when we mix a purple from both of these two colours. So first of all, we'll do the madder. It's a nice colour to be sure, but I've seen brighter purples. Now we'll do the quinacridone pink. And I'm sure you can see the difference on camera. So if you have Alizarin Crimson in your palette, there's no need to throw it away. As I said, it can be very useful for flower painting. But when it comes to mixing, it's just not as bright as a purer pink. The same would go if you were to mix it into something like a warm sunset orange. Using a pink like this one is going to give such a fresher, clearer result. And so it's not that there's anything wrong with Alizarin Crimson. It's just that when it comes to mixing with other colours, it's simply not as versatile and there are not as many uses for it in your palette. If you do have it, I would save it for things like flower painting. You might find some use for it if you're doing perhaps somebody's clothing or something like that. But when it comes to mixing, particularly purples, you're probably going to need something a little bit fresher. Now, ultramarine is a really, really beautiful colour. It granulates heavily. In fact, it's probably one of the most granulating pigments that you can get. It's also an expensive pigment, which means if you're using a cheaper range, you could find this colour's a little bit murky and not as clear as you'd like it to be. I see so many beginners getting in trouble with ultramarine. Let's have a look at it. So I've got some ultramarine here. This one is Ultramarine Deep by Talon's Rembrandt. If I swatch it for you, on its own it's beautiful and bright. It is a very granular colour. I'm on quite a smooth paper here, a practice paper, so it may not show up very well. There are a couple of places where people get into trouble with ultramarine. Now if you use it on its own like this, if you're painting perhaps a Mediterranean pot, it would look very beautiful. You couldn't go far wrong. The difficulty comes when beginners use it in skies. Now certainly here in the UK, you rarely get a sky of this colour. And even in warmer climates, I'm not sure it's always the best choice. I have seen very experienced painters use it effectively in skies. They're almost always people that paint with a very light touch and have an overall very pale palette. This is a strong granular colour, and if you are going to use it in skies, you're going to have to keep it very light indeed. Which, if that suits your painting style, is fine, but if you're like me and you like to ram the dark colours on, then this is not going to look great in skies. Added to that, the issue that some of the cheaper ones aren't as beautiful as this and really look rather murky. You can end up with very heavy looking skies. Another problem for beginners is understanding what happens when you mix this colour with yellow to get green. So I've got some Hansa yellow here, which is similar to lemon, and we'll pop it on here and we'll mix this together. Now you can see we've got a green here. It's certainly not a bad green. In fact, ultramarine makes some really beautiful natural looking greens. But the problem is, if it's the only blue that you own, you're never going to get very strong, fresh greens from it. And that's because ultramarine tends towards the red end of the spectrum. In other words, it tends towards being slightly purplish. And as soon as you include a third primary colour into a mix, so you haven't just got the blue and the yellow, you've got that hint of red in it, it's going to dull your greens down. And so you're going to get very natural, very granular looking greens. As I said, they certainly have a place in flower painting and garden painting. But if the ultramarine is the only blue you've got, perhaps the only other one you've got is a cerulean, which is often included in beginners sets, you're going to struggle to create bright, fresh, clean greens. Now I have an answer for both of these problems, both the sky problem and the green problem. And that answer is phthalo blue. And the colours I'm using in these little pots are by Jackman's Art Materials here in the UK. Some of them are manufacturers' samples. You can find a link to their paints in the description of this video. They're a company that I work with. So here is a phthalo blue, and you can see it's a lot more turquoise. And so when it's mixed with yellow, it's going to give fresher, brighter greens. And so you can get a full range of both more muted, dull greens and brighter greens if you add this colour to your palette. It can also help with those skies, because perhaps you like ultramarine, but you find it is too granular and heavy in a sky. You have the option of sort of mixing half and half with phthalo. Phthalo is a very strong colour. You'll need plenty of water. We can get a sky colour that's more natural. It's bright and fresh. It still has that touch of granulation. But because it's a transparent colour, you've really halved the granulation by having half of this and half of the ultramarine. It can also be used alone in skies or mixed with another colour like cerulean. So whilst ultramarine is a very beautiful colour, it's very heavy and very granular. And so do take care when mixing it into skies. And do also understand that if you're mixing greens from it, those greens will be more muted and more dull. They certainly have a place in garden painting and florals, but you may need a brighter blue as well. If you're enjoying this video, can I just pop in and ask you, could you please click the like button, the thumbs up button? If you like this video, perhaps share it with a friend, leave me a comment, or subscribe to the channel, which is completely free. YouTube will push this video out to more people, and I can keep making free content that helps more people learn how to paint and draw. Do you have raw umber in your paint box? It's included in many starter sets. It's a very weak, cool brown. I find there are usually two camps with this. People either sort of give it a try and sort of say, well, don't know what I'd use that for, and never touch it again. Or they stick it in everything, making everything a little bit murky. Let's look at raw umber and the best way to use it. So I've actually had people come into my art classes and they're sort of prodding at their pan paints and they're saying to me, what's wrong with this colour, Michelle? All the others are sort of bright and this one I can barely get any colour up. It's really weak. Is there something wrong with my paints? And they're talking about raw umber, because the truth is it's a very light colour. It's just naturally weak. You're never going to get it very strong. Now, where people go wrong with this colour is they either don't use it at all because they don't understand the properties of it and they don't understand how useful it is, or they stick it in everything because it's often a little bit less scary than using something strong like Payne's grey, so they'll dump it in all sorts of shadows and all sorts of mixes. To my mind, it's not a colour that goes well into these shadow type mixes. I had one lady used to come to my art classes and she pretty much ruined everything by sticking raw umber in everything and dulling everything down. But let's think about this colour. Do you see how useful it is for things like light coloured wood, for those pale branches that you get in botanicals? There are a couple of other really cool things we can do with this colour as well. I've got some Daniel Smith Payne's grey here, and we can mix this in, further cool this colour down. Look at that, we can make some beautiful colours for things like driftwood and concrete. Now, one thing to note about this particular mix where I'm mixing Payne's grey is that depending on the brand that you're using, this mix could go green. And the reason it might go green is because if your raw umber has quite a lot of yellow in and your Payne's grey has quite a lot of blue in, it can go slightly greenish, in which case you just need a touch of pink and that will balance that right out. Another useful mix for this colour is to combine it with yellow ochre for beaches. So by itself, yellow ochre is too yellow and too bright for beaches. I see this when students are creating what I like to call banana beaches. But let's look what happens if we combine it with our raw umber. And we can get some really natural textured colour that's very good for sandy beaches and things like sandstone. If I had to pick one colour that beginners get in trouble with more than any other, I would pick Phthalo Green. Now, it's not included in every set, and even when it is included, sometimes it's mislabeled as a Viridian. I've got a whole video about why manufacturers swap this colour out so often. I'll link to that in the description of this one. But let's talk about Phthalo Green. So I've got some White Nights paint here by St. Petersburg. It's labelled Emerald Green, but it's actually, from the pigment number, it's actually Phthalo Green. Now, Phthalo Green is one of the most mislabelled paints out there. They'll call it all sorts of names. They'll sometimes call it Viridian. This colour here is a true Viridian, but Viridian pigment is expensive. So sometimes in beginner's sets, you may get a colour called Emerald Green or Viridian Green, and it is in fact Phthalo Green. You can easily have a look at the pigment number. It'll say PG, pigment green, then it'll have some numbers after it. Just put them into Google and you'll be able to see what you're actually dealing with. And let's look at this colour. So it's strong, it's transparent, it's incredibly bright. It's a fantastically useful colour for mixing. You'll find it in all sorts of other colours if you've got a ready mix green, one that's not a single pigment, one that has a name. Like a Daniel Smith green gold. Look on the back, you'll find they've all got a touch of Phthalo Green in because it's a fantastically useful base colour for mixing other colours from. The problem is that it's sometimes the only green in a beginner's set, and it's possibly the only green that's rarely found in nature. Now, some of you may be living somewhere like Brazil near a rainforest, and you're going to tell me that there are plants of this colour. I absolutely believe you, but when you consider all of the greens in the world, it is rare to find a green as bright as this in nature, particularly in Europe or the UK. And even where you have a colour like this found in nature, it's not going to be the only green. And so when beginners use this as the base for all of their greens, they often end up with very bright, very lurid, very unnatural looking landscapes. There are a couple of ways that you can instantly turn this into a much better green. The first one is you can simply neutralise it by putting some pink in. I'll grab a little of the Alizarin Crimson we used, but the brighter pink would be even better. And you'll start to neutralise this green a bit and push it much more towards a grey green. Phthalo is a very blue-based green, so another way of instantly making it look more realistic and giving you a wider range of greens is to drop a warm yellow in. You can see we're getting some moss greens here. We could mix like this. So if this green is your only green, take some time to mix it with the other colours in your box. Try using some pink. Try using all of the yellows that you own, even an orange, and make yourself a much wider range of greens, because if you paint your whole landscape in phthalo green, it's not going to look realistic, even if you live in the rainforest, because it's just too distinctive and you need to have a much wider range of greens in your box. As you can see, you can mix all of those. You can even experiment with adding more blue to expand your range. Many professional artists will tell you not to use Payne's Grey. Payne's Grey has some black pigment in, and beginners can get in a lot of trouble when they stick it in everything to darken colours or use it for every single shadow that exists in the world. I am not someone that tells you not to use Payne's Grey. It's one of my favourite colours, but I will admit that beginners can get in trouble with it. Let's look now at Payne's Grey. Remember when you were a kid and you had a set of paints and there was always a colour in there called skin tone, and you used to paint it onto your paper and it looked like cat sick, and you were just kind of thinking to yourself, who on earth has skin tone this colour? Well, the answer is no one, obviously. But sometimes with Payne's Grey, people almost treat it the same as a universal shadow and darkening colour. It's why some professional artists I know have literally banned it from their classes. It contains black pigment usually, and it can really kill your colours and have a dulling effect, and yet it's an incredibly useful colour. So let's talk about what you shouldn't use it for and what you should use it for. You absolutely shouldn't be using it to darken colours. If you don't know how to do that and keep them looking clean and fresh, I have a whole video on the subject. I'll link to that one in the description of this video. You also shouldn't be using it as some kind of universal shadow colour. However, I do find that it works really well as a shadow on white buildings. If you have those sort of summer scenes where you've got a white building, there's very strong shadows being cast onto that building, then Payne's Grey can be great for that. It can also be good, and I'll use it a little thicker here, as sort of a replacement for black if you don't want something as harsh as black. The best way of thinking about Payne's Grey, and it does vary between brands, but the best way of thinking about it is as a very strong dark blue. Because it is heavily blue leaning, all greys are majority blue pigment, and Payne's Grey especially. So think about what you would mix with blue, and then you have some great ideas for your Payne's Grey. So you might mix blue with yellow. And we can do this with our Payne's Grey and get some beautiful muted greens. We can mix with pinks and roses, and we're back to our Alizarin Crimson here. We can get some very moody purplish sky colours going on, great for storm clouds. Can also mix it with blues, again getting some darker, more stormy colours that are perfect for skies. So we've spoken about Payne's Grey, and we really have to speak about black. Now, black is a colour that many professional artists do not use at all. And that's because, as we said at the beginning, it's a surface that absorbs all light rather than a hue as such. There are a few occasions when I do use black, but there are an awful lot more when I wouldn't go near it. Let's talk about black. So I've got some lamp black here. You can see how strong and dark it is. Let's water it down and see what it looks like. Looks like soot, doesn't it? Which is what you would expect from a lamp black. Let's contrast it with the Payne's Grey. Now we see how much cleaner and bluer the Payne's Grey looks. That said, I do not avoid black completely. What I would say about black is don't mix with it. Don't mix it with other colours, and for goodness sake, don't use it to darken anything, because you will absolutely kill the colour. However, there is a little bit of pure black to be found in nature. Often if you look at darks, like a dark tree trunk or something that looks black initially, you'll see that it isn't really black, and it's better to use a dark brown, a dark purple, a dark blue. But occasionally you have something like zebra stripes or animal eyes or whiskers, when black might be just the thing. Use it sparingly, use it in a pure way, and for goodness sake, don't mix it into other colours. Many professional artists and tutors will tell you never to go near any semi-opaque or opaque watercolours. They only want you to use transparent colours that glow and are fresh and clear. Of course, those colours are completely beautiful, but I do see a very strong place for opaque or semi-opaque watercolours in your palette. They can really give solidity to items. They can be used like a brick wall against a stained glass window to throw other colours forwards. However, they can also be very, very problematic to use. One of the most opaque watercolours that you might find in your palette is Naple's Yellow. We're also going to look at a few others. I'm going to explain how to use them effectively. So I've got some Naple's Yellow here. Now, when you find a colour that's slightly opaque, there are several ways of telling. It will tend to crack more than other colours. It will look somewhat chalky. If you've ever put gouache paints out on a palette and found that they all crack or fall off the palette, you'll have noticed this phenomenon before. We can also test how transparent a colour is by swatching across a black line of permanent ink. So let's paint across this line here. And just so you can see the difference, I'll swatch some Azo Yellow here, which is a more transparent colour. And straight away you can see what's going on. Now at first glance the second one is a much more attractive colour, but actually I really like Naples Yellow. There's something very delicate and beautiful about it, and there's certainly a place in your palette for opaque watercolours. Now if you've ever painted with gouache, which is a more extreme form of opaque watercolour, you'll have noticed that it doesn't layer very well. Underneath layers tend to lift and go muddy, and that's the trick to using these opaque paints. One of my favourite opaque colours is Nickel Titanate. It's a bit like lemon, but it doesn't have that acidity, which makes it a very useful colour for florals, particularly things like primroses that just don't have the brightness that lemon has. I also find colours like this fantastic for landscape painting. Here in the UK we have fields full of rapeseed, and you get these bright yellow fields in the distance. I love to drop in a field of nickel titanate. The opacity of it makes it really stand out. Other more opaque colours you'll find in your palette are cadmiums, although they're not as opaque as these colours here. They're more of your semi-opaque colours. Any colours that have potters in front of them, so potter's pink, again an incredibly dull and opaque colour, but with its own type of beauty. The trick to using these colours is to make them the stars of their own show. Don't try layering them or mixing them with other colours. You'll make those colours murky and you'll take away the beauty of the colours themselves. The best way to use semi-opaques and opaque watercolours is to place them on your paper and leave them alone. The next two colours are linked because they're often made from the same base pigment. I'm talking about Cerulean Blue and Cobalt Blue. Now these aren't problematic because they're difficult to use. They're incredibly useful colours, but there can be an issue with them, especially in cheaper sets. Let me explain why. When I first started painting, I was obsessed with Cerulean Blue, and luckily for me, I bought one of the best ones on the market. So this is Talon's Rembrandt Cerulean Blue. I now use many other brands. I work with Jackman's here in the UK. I also like Winsor & Newton, Daniel Smith, lots of different brands. But this is the brand that I first started with, and I found this colour so useful. It was beautiful in skies. Mixed with pink, it made the most delicate lilacs. And when I put my yellows into it, I got the softest, most dreamy greens. I also loved Cobalt Blue, a real mid-range blue. Slightly brighter and less granulating than Ultramarine, and certainly less far towards the purple end of the spectrum. I loved to make mid-range greens from this. They had a fresh, bright quality without being overbearing. So at this point you're saying to me, well, what's wrong with these two blues and why do people get into trouble with them? Let me explain. These are some of the most expensive pigments that you can get, which means they're the first ones that manufacturers swap out. So what do you do if you can't afford expensive paints? If you can't afford the artist quality and you've just got a student's range, you need to swatch those colours and say to yourself, which of these are really quite nice? And many of them will be perfectly usable in a student's set. Which ones just look a bit dull? Because of all the colours I've tried, I can tell you ceruleans in cheap brands are horrible. They're some of the worst paints you can get. They're dull, they're muddy. They leave your whole painting lacking freshness, particularly when you've used them in skies. Ultramarines can also be quite expensive. Remember, there are very few blue pigments found naturally in nature. So historically, the blues were very difficult to produce and very expensive to produce. So even if you've got a cheaper, more economical student set, do have a look at your blues and see if you could possibly think about upgrading and buying an artist quality version of your cerulean, your cobalt, even your ultramarine. It's going to make such a difference to the brightness of your paintings. If you're looking at categorising your colours and you've got your primaries and your secondaries and your earth colours, it can often be difficult to know what to do with yellow ochre. Is it a yellow or is it an earth colour? Well, actually, it's both. It's in almost every beginner's set, and beginners can get into a lot of trouble with it because it's a very heavy, granular, dull pigment. There are some things it's really useful for, but there are also some things you should never use it for. Let's talk now about yellow ochre. So we're back to yellow ochre again. I've already shown you a couple of really interesting uses for it in this video. I showed you how mixing it with raw umber can make some interesting beach textures. But here's the problem with yellow ochre. It's very dull and it's very granular. So if you're a beginner and really it's the only yellow you've got, You don't stand a chance in hell of making a decent bright green with it. It's just not possible. It's going to make dull, granular greens. Now, like everything, there's certainly a place for those sort of greens within your painting. If I mix it with Payne's grey, I can get a colour worthy of the outside of a kiwi fruit. But if you're trying to use it to mix fresh greens and fresh oranges, you're only going to be disappointed. For me, the most useful application of yellow ochre is in landscape painting, beaches, pathways. And if you're painting landscapes, this is a mixed colour here. This is my forest shadow colour from my shadows set. If you're painting a landscape or a foreground, that granular texture given by the yellow ochre is going to be great. Just don't overdo it, and remember to mix some brighter yellows in too. With all colours, it's about understanding the properties of the colour and using it in an application that shows off that colour to its best advantage, rather than trying to do something which the colour itself was never meant to do. Lastly, let's talk about white paint. It's always been a sense of annoyance to me that white is included in beginners sets, because generally speaking, white is not used as part of watercolour painting. It certainly shouldn't be used to lighten your colours. I myself am not averse to using white, but I don't always like the white that's included in a watercolour set, which is zinc white. I myself prefer a titanate white. Let's talk about white and what you can use it for. I actually have another video that deep dives into the really great things that you can do with white paint. I'll link that one in the description of this video in case you'd like to watch it after this one. So I've got here some titanium white, and this is a white. This one is actually categorized as watercolor. You can see it's gone rather solid in the tube there. I'm just being too lazy to open my other tube of it. And this is actually the stronger of the whites, the more opaque of the whites. You may have in a watercolor set a zinc white, which is weaker. Now, the thing to understand about white is not just that it lightens colors, but that it makes any colour more opaque. So where we were looking at our opaque colours, as opposed to our transparent colours like this azo yellow, if we mix white in with this, it's going to make this creamier and more opaque. Now, people can be very snooty about white paint, and you may hear people say, oh, well, I only use watercolours in the traditional transparent way. You shouldn't use any white paint. The white of the paper must glow through. It's the traditional way of using watercolour, to which I suggest you direct them to Mr. Turner's paintings, because all of the original watercolourists used white paint, or body colour as they called it. There really is no need to be snooty about white paint. However, there are some ways of using it that can look very unnatural, and in the majority of watercolour painting, it's not necessary to use white at all. You would just be using the white of the paper, because here's the thing, the opacity of white paint or gouache paint does not reflect light in the same way that the transparency of watercolour does. So if, for example, you painted a watercolour painting and then touched up all the white areas with white paint, it would look a bit like you were putting typewriter corrector fluid on it. When the light caught it, you would see all of those white dabs. It would look, frankly, quite awful. But that's not to say there aren't some very interesting and good uses of white paint. If I mix it with this yellow, for example, and then I splatter it, I'm going to be able to splatter light on dark, or even dot it on like this. That's something I wouldn't otherwise be able to do. And because it's got a touch of colour in, it's going to look a lot less noticeable. I've got a whole video all about the uses of white paint that are going to help you to incorporate it sometimes into your watercolour paintings without it looking unnatural, without killing the natural glow of your watercolours. I'll link to that other video in the description of this one. Colour mixing and understanding colour is vital for getting good results in your paintings. You already know that, or you wouldn't be watching this video. If you'd like an extra video from me every single week all about colour mixing, colour matching, brand comparisons, and easy to understand technical information, just like we've been talking about in this video, please do click the join button below. A little box will pop up and tell you how you can get extra content, or for a lower price, just make a small contribution to the channel, which helps me to make more free videos for everybody. And before you leave this video, don't forget to have a look in that video description. Any videos that I've talked about within this video will be linked down there, so more colour mixing stuff. You can also download some free PDF guides. There's even a free watercolour painting course that you can take for no money. You can also find out all about my more comprehensive online courses. And if you enjoyed this video, you can watch another one of my videos right now.